Welcome to the Album Anniversary Podcast. Today's show is about Achilles' Heel by Pedro the Lion. It was released May 25th, 2004, celebrating a 20-year anniversary. Hi, I'm your host Caleb, or Caleb the Spy on Twitter and Instagram, and every day on those social media sites I post about what I call album anniversaries, and it's just the anniversary of the album's release date. If I don't know the release date, I randomly throw a day on the calendar, and it's just a day to celebrate that album. A couple years ago, I started this tradition of just documenting some of my favorite albums on a calendar, and I would, mark their release date as a day to celebrate the album, a day to listen to it. In the last year, though, the list of albums has grown significantly, and I still have this in the notes that I don't know the exact number, but I do because I counted it. Right now, I have 2,296 albums or events tracked in my calendar, and I post about those throughout the week. I'll get it out there. I'm no musician. Instead, I'm just a huge music fan. I oftentimes will focus on things like ska and punk, alt-rock, especially from the 90s. And in the 90s, I was super into the Christian music scene, and I've always kind of had a fascination with historically important albums or musical events. So we've had a couple formats on this show, but today's show, I'm joined by Adrian, and we're going to answer 5 simple questions about Achilles' Heel by Pedro the Lion. Adrian, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much, man. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your musical journey. Some people were raised in a house where music was on all the time. Or they just kind of discovered it at some point later in their life. So kind of tell us a little bit about how you got into music and kind of started connecting with music.
So I didn't grow up in a family that played a lot of music, like in terms of playing instruments or whatever, but we did listen to a lot, but it was also a really conservative Christian Southern Baptist household. My dad was a pastor, and so our musical diet was really strict.
Okay.
And so we mostly listened to like bluegrass that my uncle played, which was awesome, or oldies. And we didn't really branch out a whole lot beyond that. Smooth jazz was really big in the early 90s.
Okay.
But even even Christian rock, like CCM was kind of forbidden for my very early years. And they didn't really break free from that until probably like 8th grade when I was finally allowed to buy Wow 98.
Okay.
And I remember like standing in Walmart and I had to promise that I wouldn't listen to the DC Talk track because they particularly didn't like those dudes.
Really?
Which of course, the first thing I did when I got home was listen to DC Talk, But they got over that pretty quickly, and even like a few years later, they were letting me start my own rock bands and were my biggest supporters. So it was great. But we did listen to a lot of oldies, and I think I really enjoyed that. Like, even though it was like what I was allowed to listen to, I didn't really dislike it just because I thought it was great music. So yeah, I think, Beatles, Mamas and the Papas, Donovan, like just some older folk stuff. My uncle that I mentioned played bluegrass. He was in a bluegrass band, and he was an incredible guitarist, and we listened to a lot of his like 60s and 70s like folk revivalist kind of friends, like Ian and Sylvia, that kind of stuff.
Cool. So it kind of started with that wow, and then obviously we're into music enough to kind of try and start your own band. So what moment do you feel like you kind of, I always say the phrase like became your own, or you kind of fell in love? And I ask that question because I can always kind of mark mine. And so like you may not have that moment, but was there a moment, or kind of that time frame where it shifted and it was like, this is now my music, and you kind of really started to fall in love with music, and it was outside of that family unit?
Yeah, I think Pedro the Lion was probably part of that. I don't know if there was like one specific moment, but I think when I stumbled on Pedro the Lion's album Control in a small bookstore and picked it up, and just kind of blew my mind. So I think kind of falling into that, and then I take that back. I think if I had to narrow it down to a moment, it would probably be my brother got a various artists CD called oh my gosh, I'm blanking on what it's called. It's something Lambs.
Roaring Lambs?
Roaring Lambs. Thank
Yeah.
you. I knew you would know. Yeah. And it had, it had some like pretty staple names on there. Like I think Michael Tate was on a track with somebody and stuff like that. But it was my first introduction to Over the Rhine.
Okay.
And Bill Maloney. And I think those two tracks in particular. Oh, and Sixpence is my first introduction to Sixpence outside of like Kiss Me. I'd heard Kiss Me on the radio. But, and I think like hearing that like really clever, beautifully written folky stuff, and then particularly hearing Karen Bergquist's voice from Over the Rhine and just the way that she sang was just so beautiful, but also like a little bit crazy. Like I remember thinking like towards the end of that song, like she sounds drunk, but in a really cool way. And of course, like now it's normal, but like if the most radical female vocalist you've heard up to that point is like, Twyla Paris or something, then like obviously it's a different thing. So yeah, I think maybe that was kind of the moment where I was like, okay, I think this is my thing. I think I like singer-songwriter stuff. I like a little bit of like the alt country, alt folk kind of vibe. And even though David Bazan or Pedro the Lion was a little bit more on the rock side, I think they still kind of lean into that a little bit.
For sure.
So yeah, that was probably where I started to be like, all right, I think I know what my thing is now.
Nice. The only reason I could pull that Roaring Lions, it actually is one of the anniversaries that's coming up in the next couple of weeks, because
is it really? Wow.
I set them up like I'm trying to get a month ahead, and I'm right around that spot. So usually the posts that you see like come out on social media, I've set those up like a month ago. So that's it's coming up fairly soon, because I think
cool.
it's coming up in the next couple of weeks.
I'm excited.
I could be totally wrong, and then I just did remember it that well, which is not likely. Well, that's great. With that, let's jump in and let's talk about again. And I joked before the show that Achilles heel. I don't know if I've ever said that out loud to somebody else. I have a lot of people that I've talked with music about, but there's always these albums that I come to. So Achilles heel by Pedro the Lion, released again, like we said, May 25th, 2004. So celebrating a 20-year anniversary. And I'm just going to go through a little history. If there's stuff you want to jump in on, this is stuff that I just kind of found on the internet, just kind of doing before the show. So if there's stuff you know more about or want to add to it, feel free to jump in, and then we'll jump into those questions. So yeah, this album was actually produced by David Bazan. And I think it was recorded in his home studio, which I don't know if that was a huge change, but that was something I found out about this. Two other people on the album. I think there were other contributors, but James McAllister was on drums, and I think he's a fairly frequent contributor. And then TW/Tim Walsh, who is also a consistent contributor to Pedro the Lion throughout the years, was also on this album. And I don't know if he had been on the last couple, and I think that was kind of one of the big deals with this, is that he had come back for this album. Let's see. It reached number 26 on the Heatseekers, which I don't understand how the Heatseekers work, but it seems like a lot of albums end up on there. So there you go. I'm going to throw out those 26 on the Heatseekers. And it was number 24 on the independent charts. So it charted really well on that as well. Let's see here. It did open to kind of mixed reviews. A lot of the reviews I could find, there were some positive, there were some less positive. And I will say, if you want to read an interesting review of it, the Pitchfork review was very unforgiving. I think it was like a 4.7.
Oh, yeah. I read, Pitchfork in general is typically unforgiving, but that was rough. Yeah, when I saw that in the show notes, I hadn't read that review before, and so I went back and read it, and I was like, oh man, this is brutal. I didn't
even read it. I just was like, I got like a little bit into it, and I was like, all right, I'm good. I know where we're going here.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's funny. And I will say this is an interesting one, is this wasn't really a concept album, where I know some of the previous records that's kind of what he had become known for in some circles. I think Control's a big concept album, and then I think even the one before this is also a concept album. I could be wrong, and maybe Control's the one before this. But yeah, that's something that I did that was interesting. And then, oh man, I had it in the notes, but then I deleted it because I was doing this offline. I think is this his fourth album as Pedro the Lion? I want to say yes.
I think so. That sounds right. Yeah, because there's Control, Good Friends Are Hard to Find, And then I think there's another one that I'm missing before, even earlier.
It's Hard to Find a Friend.
Hard to
Winners
Find a
Never
Friend,
Quit,
that's it, yeah.
Control, Achilles Heel. So yeah, this was his fourth.
Yeah.
Am I trying to do notes while I didn't have internet? Bit me in the butt there. So this is going to be a little, I don't know, it's not controversial by any means, but I think this is kind of the last album where he identifies as a Christian. I know we kind of talked about some of your inroads into music were Christian music related. So this is definitely an album that I think still kind of falls in that CCM world at the very least. Even if he is not now, I still kind of consider him CCM and Christian music adjacent. But I think this is kind of that last album where he identifies as a Christian. Is that feel correct to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think, even maybe a little bit into his first solo album, which is the name of that's I'm blanking on that right now, but I saw him live shortly after his first solo album, and we got to chat a little bit after the show, because that's just the kind of guy that he is, and he just stays around and hangs out, and he still does. It's awesome. And just had like some candid conversations about faith, and I think he was still like holding on to the threads a little bit even then. But yeah, you certainly see it start to kind of fall apart a little bit here. I think it was definitely the last one that was by any stretch like marketed, and I don't even know if they were intentionally marketed to CCM, but like it was a buzz in the CCM world when it came out for sure.
Yeah.
Because he was still playing like Cornerstone and, other Christian festivals like that.
Part of the reason that that's also interesting is that I believe, now I was aware of this, and we might get this later, but I was aware of this album. This album, I think, stirred up quite the controversy, mostly because of the lyrics to Foregone Conclusions, which I'll read them. You were too busy steering the conversation towards the Lord to hear the voice of the Spirit begging you to shut the F up. And I'll
that'll do it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean that's interesting that this was marketed to a Christian audience, and that's kind of where he had been. But then to drop that on there probably was. I mean, I don't know. Do you remember any of that sort of controversy when it came out, or?
I wasn't as online then as I am now. And like just controversies in general were a little bit harder to find.
Yeah, that's true.
But I do remember just at least like within my friends group, and like I didn't have a ton of friends that were into Pedro the Lion, but the ones I did, there were some who were just like, oh, well, we're done with Pedro the Lion.
Okay.
Like, this isn't, like it's a bridge too far. And then the others who were like, right on, he said the F word, you know what I mean? Like, super stoked by it. And it's certainly one that, I wouldn't have been advertising to my youth pastor or something that I was listening to. So I don't know, like outside of that, how big the controversy went. I do remember randomly on, let's see, it would have been before this record came out, so I guess it would have been controversy around Control.
Okay.
Because I think he might have had a little bit of light cursing on Control, too. I don't remember for sure. But I do remember there was buzz, because we didn't live too far from the Cornerstone Festival.
Oh, okay.
I remember when he played his last gig there, before they kind of shut down Cornerstone, there was a point coming up in the song where all of his diehard fans, like in this tent, know that he's about to cuss.
Right.
And they're all like waiting to see, is he going to do it? And this is what I read from an article. I wasn't there, unfortunately. There was an article that came out. I don't remember who released it, but I found it when I was doing some research for a paper. And they're all like waiting, like, is he going to do it? Is he going to cuss? Because, there was like a strict, like, no cussing rule at Cornerstone. Sure. And he did. He said it. And when he said it, according to this guy who was there writing this article, like underwear went flying onto the stage. Like they were like poised and ready to like celebrate this rebellion.
Oh my gosh.
And apparently like at that gig, like he was walking around with what looked to be like a gallon jug of water, but it was like 50% water, 50% vodka, because he was still like deep in his like alcoholism back then.
Sure.
So I know just at least from like his minglings in the Christian world at stuff like Cornerstone, there was certainly a buzz of controversy kind of following him, because he's obviously like I don't think he's ever been a mean dude, but he certainly didn't have like any regard for those kinds of rules,
Yes.
really. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't really care.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
and so I think that kind of that reputation sort of followed him around, even though he's a super nice guy. So I do remember hearing about that, and like reading that article was fascinating. And also just like a little bit sad, because you also know, like, behind the scenes, like, he's like battling depression and alcoholism and all that other stuff. So like, while the fan base is like giddy that he's cussing at Cornerstone, he's also like suffering behind the scenes. So, you know, it's just a two-sided coin of a lot of performers, I guess. But so yeah, that's the most that I heard of the controversy, was just that kind of account from what was going on at Cornerstone and some of the other gigs that he was playing.
Okay. Well, that's cool. That's not cool. That makes sense. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good context. So cool. And then my last note on history is that it was the last Pedro the Lion album that we got for 15 years. Obviously, he did a bunch of solo work in between there, and I think he has since. I've heard him say a couple times actually that he really wishes he would have just stuck with Pedro the Lion through all of that, because it makes it really confusing to figure out which is which. So, which is kind of funny. That out of the way, unless there's any other history you want to bring up, I'd say let's jump into the questions.
All right.
Bands with managers are going places.
First question is, so how did you first discover this album?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I stumbled upon Pedro the Lion's Control album completely by accident. I had kind of a habit of, like, when I wanted something new to listen to, I would go pick an album by artwork, and
Sure.
the Control artwork's not even like super flashy, but just something about it kind of intrigued me, and it wasn't even one of the places where it had like a listening station or whatever. So I didn't know what it sounded like. It was like categorized in like the Christian music section, which is funny. So I picked that up, and that was kind of like a slow burn. I feel like when I first bought it, I wasn't quite ready for it. But then eventually it became, you know, one of my favorite records. So I was always kind of like keeping my ear to the ground, trying to figure out when he was going to put out another record. And I bought it probably like days after it released, I imagine. I don't remember for sure, but I definitely jumped on it right away.
You were right in when it came out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I was already like, at that point, I was in a pretty established, like, I think this is my favorite artist right now kind of vibe. Yeah.
So you used the word "not ready for it" when you picked up Control. That's me for sure, especially in 2004. Which in 2004 I am not in. I'm post college. I'm living with a buddy, post college. So, but I definitely was not ready for Pedro the Lion until much later. So yeah, that's a good word for it. And I wasn't in general, because I wasn't. But so yeah, I was aware. I remember when this album came out because my roommate, I think, was interested in it. But that was about it for me. He was kind of a Pedro the Lion fan at the time.
Yeah.
I don't wanna believe that all of the above is true, but I could be persuaded if you were to give me proof. So why don't you come over Thursday? Maybe we can talk it through, as if some new information were possible to comprehend or introduce. And after all, you and I are nothing more than foregone conclusions.
All right, so the big question, which kind of leads to all the other questions, is, so what do you love about this album?
Oh man, so much.
Well, take your time. There's no rush.
I was trying to, you know, I listened to it through a couple times a day, and this week, just to try to like refresh my memory, be like, what really captivated me? Because honestly, I hadn't listened to it in a long time, really. And I think part of that is just because, like, you know, you move on and my life is in such a different place than it was now. And just to put it in perspective, as far as timing goes, 2004 was the year that I graduated high school.
Okay.
So like senior year it's a big deal. You're really like stepping out and like, being dumb and making your dumb mistakes, trying to figure out who you are and stuff like that. And this was kind of the soundtrack for that. But yeah, just in terms of the production, I think I've been really interested in recording and recording techniques for a long time.
For sure.
At this point, I was already like reading like recording how-to books and stuff, which were like, we're still pretty early in the days of like Pro Tools and Logic and stuff at this point. I really appreciated their sound that he got on all of their records. Just that very like, it sounds like a home studio, but in a really good way. It doesn't. And so I liked that it wasn't polished, but it was still beautiful, if that makes sense. And I felt like that took a little bit more skill somehow than, just making things perfect in a studio. So I really liked just the tones that he got, the soundscapes that he was building, and I think he still does.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the lyrics. I mean, he's such an amazing lyricist and a really unique lyricist. He was definitely like the darkest lyrics I was listening to at the time.
For sure.
I don't really know if I've listened to anyone darker since then, honestly. But like just his storytelling style was really cool, but the stories that he'd tell were really weird. And like you said, like this one not being a concept album, it's a little bit more disjointed. It's not as uniform. But yeah, I think for Foregone Conclusions, when he has that iconic line, I think that was sort of at a crossroads in my life where growing up in this like Southern Baptist pastor's home, and like I still, I'm getting ready to leave high school, but I still love Jesus, but I'm starting to like try to step out on my own and figure out what my faith means in terms of how I view the rest of the world. And like every high school senior, you're like being introduced to all new things, and so new perspectives. And also like this was right either like I don't remember when we invaded Iraq, but it was like around that time.
Yeah.
And so like like you've got like super like pro-Bush family members, and then you're listening to very anti-Bush music. That's kind of like putting you in this awkward place. You're like, am I going to get drafted next year? That kind of stuff. And so all of those like post 9/11 emotions like swirling, I think the way that I reckoned my faith through the help of some like really bold Christian songwriters was formative for me. I think Derek Webb is kind of in that same category around the same time. Even I even think of like Nicole Nordman, like had a song on one of the Wow albums that I had that was like Wrestling with Doubt. And so when I got to like Foregone Conclusions, and I was like, yeah, like I don't know if I agree with his word choice, but I think that there is merit to this idea of like we're kind of evangelizing ourselves to death, or maybe sometimes God does just want us to like shut up sometimes and like listen to somebody else, or like wash somebody's feet rather than proselytize or whatever. And so, in my own like teenage rebellion ways, like that kind of like scratched an itch for me where I thought, well, maybe you can be a Christian and have some of these contrarian views on what it means to be a Christian. And I grew up in a really, really small town, really small high school. And so I feel like he was kind of the gateway drug into like sort of that whole other branch of thinking. And so where I was spiritually at the time, I think it met a need, and it really kind of scratched an itch of like, there's got to be a different way of viewing faith and doing Christianity right now.
I can connect to that. I think that's the thing that I've liked about Pedro the Lion and David Bazan is some of that contrarian. There's a couple words that you use, that contrarian viewpoint. I've always felt very connected to that, even though I wasn't probably listening to this back then. And then, man, when you described it as not polished but still beautiful, that is a great description. That is perfect, because I think that's what I really appreciate about, there's a lot of music I appreciate that about, where it doesn't feel as polished, but it still is beautiful, or it still is unique.
Yeah.
And that is that's a wonderful description. So awesome.
Engine severs lower legs. I feel my bruised heart beating. The spinal cord remains intact, still sending and receiving. Lying back on shoulder blades, the cargo rushing past. Missing limbs beneath the cars, twitching on the tracks. Click clack, now handicap, no of them transcontinental.
I know you already touched on some of it a little bit, but why would you call this album as what would you say is about this album is important to you, or why is this album important to you?
Yeah, like I said, like I think just it was important for where I was spiritually at the time, and I think it's important in hindsight of like where I still am. Like David Bazan and I ended up taking very, very different paths.
Right.
Like I'm deeper into conservative Christendom than I was then, and like I am a Southern Baptist pastor myself now. Like I'm on staff at a Southern Baptist church, and I think the album is still important because it helped me sort of think through those things and fight those battles really, really early on. And I think that protected my heart from a lot of turmoil that some of my peers were going through in their 20s and 30s, that I'm like, yeah, like I get it. But, me and David kind of worked that out in high school,
Yeah. That's interesting, because I feel like, yes, I worked that out later, much later in life. Where I just had those conflicts. I've had those conflicts a long time, but like I really hit them hard in the last 10 years or so.
Right.
So, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To myself, if he only knew, he would climb right back in. I do, I do, I do. I
The next question here is, so what are your favorite tracks on this? And I know we've mentioned a couple, but what are some of your favorite tracks from this album?
Yeah, that's great. I had to really think about this. It was hard to pick a few, but I think my favorite track from when it came out and when I was really into it was The Poison, the last track. Again, I'm being a songwriter myself and playing mostly acoustic. I loved how full of a sound he got with just acoustic bass and drums. There's no guitar solo, there's no piano, and it's just a beautiful lyrics, super sad like he does.
Yeah.
And then other favorites, Transcontinental is really fun. It's a great vibey, like windows down kind of song.
Yeah.
And then I also really like I Do. I love any of the songs that like use, it's like an old songwriter motif of your chorus says the same thing each time, but it means something different every time. Like when he says like if his newborn child like only knew how messed up the world was, she would go back inside, and he says I do, like I do know how, and then it turns into like the I do of marriage, and then like so just the way it shifts meaning throughout is really clever. I just love the way he built that one.
Yeah. I think a song that stood out for me this time was the song Arizona, because now we've gotten the last two albums, and I think the upcoming album, they're all kind of these Arizona towns that he's kind of going through this biography. So like that,
I didn't even think about that. That's a great point.
It jumped out on me, and I'm not as connected to this. I think this album's great, but it's not like, and so like as I was like looking through, I was like, oh, this is totally what he's doing now, and like just grand in much grander nature, kind of as he goes through his childhood. It almost feels like.
Yeah.
Foregone Conclusions is still one that stands out to me. Not only just for the lyrical content, but I actually just like the vibe of that song as well. And again, I'm no musician, so
yeah,
almost all of my music takes are vibe related. So, and then I think Band with Managers is, I think that was I feel like that's a song he plays often, and it's such a weird song. That one always sticks out to me as well.
it is a weird song. I think he's played it live every time I've seen him, and which is such an odd choice. I would like, I should ask him sometime, like, why do you keep doing this song? Not that I don't like it; it's a cool song. It just seems like a weird one to keep in your repertoire all the time. But maybe it's because fans know it. I always hear people singing along, and it is an interesting one.
So, as a Pedro the Lion fan, this is not on the script. Sorry, I'm going off script. Do you have like a favorite Pedro song, or is there too many to choose from?
Oh, that's a great question.
Totally off script. I'm so sorry.
It's fine. I've got my Apple Music pulled up here, so I can probably find one. Yeah, probably Priests and Paramedics.
Okay.
From Control, like just singing "You're gonna die, we're all gonna die." I mean, it's in hindsight, it's a little like it's almost cheesy how dark it is.
Sure.
But I do think it was really powerful at the time, and it's still powerful, and just a clever way to grapple with, our finite lives and the afterlife. So yeah, I thought that was cool.
Sorry, that was totally off script. Failure
good.
as a host. Oh man,
there's so many good ones on here, and they are like unique. What's interesting is I never really got into the Fleecing. That was always my least favorite one for some reason. And it's also the one that the guy at Pitchfork, like, it really threw him off the scent. Like, he hated that song. So, and I don't know why I don't like it. The guy at Pitchfork didn't like it because he felt like it was him trying to, like, justify his faith. But honestly, I think I didn't like it because at the time I didn't really get it.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm frustrated that I don't understand this song.
That's pretty much every song for me. Not very bright.
But now it's over, and I can't stay sober. Pour and swallow, follow one shot with another, and I'll keep on till you agree to come back over, or until there are X's on my eyes.
All right, so last question then is, if somebody's never heard this before, which is always funny, I did an episode on the Blue album. This is the one I go back to. And I was like, I'm going to recommend this to you if you've never heard it. And you've stumbled across my little tiny podcast. And you're going to run into Weezer's The Blue Album for the first time. But if somebody hasn't heard this, or what's your sales pitch for somebody to go check this album out if you haven't heard it, or just, what would you tell somebody, like, hey, go check this album out? What's your sales pitch for it?
I think depending on who I'm giving the pitch to, if I'm pitching this to another Christian, I'm gonna say I think you need to go back and listen to this. I've got like Gen Z coworkers now, and I would be like, hey, I think you need to go back and listen and be like, this deconstruction thing isn't new, man. Yeah. And we've been doing this for a long time, and we can even do it together and come out in different directions. And so I think it's good to go back and just hear the struggles of your forefathers.
Yeah.
But then from a musical standpoint, I would say it's just good songwriting. Like, if you just want a master class, not necessarily in like the best songwriting you'll ever hear, but in some risky songwriting and some bold choices and some fearless choices, I think it's a good record for that reason.
Yeah, that's another great word, fearless choices. That's why I think all of his albums are worth checking out, because he's a bit of a risk taker, and I think he's just not one to be put in that box. We kind of talked about just some of that Cornerstone controversy earlier. Like, he's just not one to be put there, and so he's going to take those chances. His lyrics seem, and maybe he's pulled this off real well, but they seem very raw and very much him. There's an authentic nature to his music that I think any musician could learn from, in my opinion. So that's part of the reason I'd say all of his ours. But this one totally has that, I think, as well. So,
and also just for like the recording crew, like go back and listen to how good a live band can sound in a living room.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah, going back to that whole idea of beautiful but not polished. That's great. So that's it for Achilles Heel. Again, I hope I'm saying that right. By Pedro the Lion, released May 25th is what I have, 2004. So again, celebrating that 20-year anniversary. And, Adrian, if people want to find you online and get connected with you online, where can they find you? And, are there any other things you're out there pitching? I guess it would be the other question.
Yeah. So, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter /X/Twix, whatever you call it, at Adrian Mathenia, which it sounds complicated, but it's phonetic. And you can find my music on Apple Music and Spotify or wherever you stream music. And see, I've got a couple shows coming up in this month in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Athens, Georgia. So if you're in those areas, look us up, find the shows, and come say hi.
Awesome. When I post this on Twitter, I will, when I post about this, I'll make sure to have his Twitter handle in there, so you can definitely find him, especially if you're in those areas. Yes, please go check out those shows. That's awesome. So awesome. Well, I can't say thanks enough for joining me, taking time out of your day. I know this is everybody's busy, but I really love getting, again, an album I wasn't as familiar with until much later in life, and so I've just less of a connection with, but I know is a really important album to a lot of people. So I'm so thankful to be able to bring you on the show and be able to have a true fan talk about it, not just me, a fake fan.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, thanks so much for giving me the chance. Like when I saw that you were looking for someone to chat with us, I was like, oh, I got to jump on that. That's the one. So awesome. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great, man. Well, I'm glad it worked out, and I was so excited. And come back anytime if there's more. I'll keep on throwing those posts out. That's how it works. I mean, this is the first time I did this. You're the first one where I actually threw something out there and was like, hey, anybody want to talk about this? And you were the first one to respond, because the other one was me and him have been working on ideas for a show for a while. So I was doing that through DMs. I was kind of showing him the list. So you were my first one to kind of respond. So yeah.
Well, thank you.
So awesome. Thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it.
You bet, man.
Thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of the Album Anniversary Podcast. I want to thank my guest, Adrian, for joining me and bringing his insights and perspectives on this album. It was great to have him on the show. Let us know what you thought. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What are some of your favorites from this album? And why do you love this album? You can find me on Twitter at Caleb the Spy. I'm also on Instagram at Caleb the Spy. There's just underscores in between those words. And then you can email me at calebthespypodcasts@gmail.com. No spaces or underscores in that. If there are albums that should be on my calendar because they're worth celebrating, let me know and I'll try and get them added. If you'd like to join me on this show to talk about an album, the easiest way to do that is to follow me on Twitter. And I'm going to try, like I said in the show, I'm going to try and post about an upcoming album that's celebrating a big anniversary that I think would make for an interesting show. And if I'm looking for a guest, I'll throw it out that way. And if somebody responds, I'll try and get them on the show to talk about it. I can't choose every album. I can't do a show about every album. So I'm trying to choose albums that I think will be interesting to talk about, or, just some of my personal favorites. Please subscribe and share the podcast if you're so inclined. Leave a rating or review. I have heard it's the most effective way to spread the word about podcasts. Most of all, I want to thank you if you engage with me at all on social media. I do put a lot of time and energy into setting up those daily posts, so seeing people get excited to revisit or discover older albums is always a thrill. If you enjoyed this show, you might also enjoy the other show I do with my friend Scott. It's called I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. And it's not just a podcast where we reminisce about our youth group experience, but instead we're trying to interview fellow youth group kids from the 90s and the 2000s to see where they're at now, not only in their faith, but in life. We're not trying to convert anybody or change anybody's opinions. We just want to know where people are at, whether they're still at the same church they grew up in or they've left the faith entirely. We just want to hear where they're at and kind of how that youth group experience impacted their lives. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Sing It Out at Street Level by Peg and the Rejected. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Not very bright.